and nonviolence. What's a Franciscan to do? And we have three terrific people to discuss this with us here. And so we're going to have a bit of a discussion amongst ourselves, and then we'll welcome you, those of you in the room and those of you on the Zoom room, to ask questions. So let me introduce the panelists. The panelist to my right, Carolyn Towns, Carolyn is a secular Franciscan. She is a spiritual life and leadership coach and a lost to life mindset strategist. Since professing as a secular Franciscan in 2000, Carolyn has served in several leadership roles for the secular Franciscan order on the local, regional, national, and international levels. Most recently, as the national animator for JPIC, which we heard about this morning, Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation. Carolyn is a former board member of FAN, and she started a Franciscan Justice Circle that meets virtually for those with limited accessibility. And to Carolyn's right is Michael Poffenberger. He's the executive director of the Center for Action and Contemplation. He guides the organization in supporting inner work for those seeking to build a more just and humane world. He believes that transforming consciousness can solve many of today's challenges, and he lives this mission by supporting movements for peace and collective liberation. And we have a panelist joining us from Rome, George Weigel, who's on the screen. George Weigel is a distinguished senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's a Catholic theologian and one of America's leading public intellectuals. He's the author or editor of more than 30 books, perhaps best known for his widely translated and internationally acclaimed 2-volume biography of Pope St. John Paul II. And thank you very much for joining us from Rome, George. I know you're there for the Synod. And thank you very much to Michael and Carolyn. So we're going to start out by having, a little bit of a conversation among the four of us. And I suppose I should reintroduce myself for anyone who doesn't know me. I'm Michelle Dunn, Executive Director of Franciscan Action Network. And I should also say that, like Carolyn, I am a professed secular Franciscan. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation. I'm going to start with a few questions. And George, actually, I'd like to start with you. So I've sort of posited, the title of this panel, Polarization, that there is something, called polarization going on. And just one definition of polarization is division into two sharply contrasting groups or sets of opinions or beliefs. And I think there are many ways in which one could see American society as polarized right now, but I'm not sure whether our panelists agree or don't agree with me. And George, I'd like to know what you think. Do you see American society as polarized? Do you see it polarized politically, religiously, or not? Do you see the divisions that are going on now as being, what has happened for a long time? I'm just curious how you react to the whole conversation about polarization.
Thanks, Michelle. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you, and greetings from Rome. A few days ago, I read a fine article by my friend Kevin Williamson about what is going on in Asheville, North Carolina, in the wake of the tremendous damage done there by Hurricane Helene. It was actually a very heartening article because Kevin described how people from left, right, and center, religious believers, non-believers, Asheville hipsters, Appalachian hillbillies, were all coming together to help people who had been deeply hurt by the hurricane. It was a testimony to something that's still very good in our country, and that is its capacity to rally to meet human challenges. I was heartened by that because I also think that the polarization we experience politically is the result of a deep division culturally. I am afraid Vice President Harris is simply mistaken when she says there is much more that unites us than divides us. That's simply not true anymore. We are fundamentally divided on the nature of the human person. And this especially touches the life issues. We are fundamentally divided on the meaning of freedom. Is freedom, I did it my way, a la Frank Sinatra, or is there a richer, nobler understanding of freedom, as John Paul II taught, as doing the right thing for the right reason as a matter of moral habit? We're basically divided on questions of human solidarity. To whom do I have an obligation of solidarity in this American community? So those are real cultural problems. I think they're only going to be healed by something resembling a new Great Awakening. And I'm very hopeful that people of a Franciscan sensibility can contribute to that.
Okay, thank you very much, George. So Carolyn, let me come to you for your take on this. Do you see, George is speaking of a deep cultural division along certain lines. Do you see that going on? Do you see polarization as simply, I don't know, political tribalism that has developed, or do you think it has deeper roots? How do you see the issue?
Thank you. I think polarization has gotten somewhat of a bad rap. It's almost like conflict. Conflict is necessary, but violence is not. We're different. We're all unique. If we were the same, there would be no need of most of us, right? The issue is, though, how we show up in that difference. I don't need to prove you wrong in order to prove myself right. When we have conflicts or when there's any kind of differences, the tendency, the first tendency, instead of listening to the other, is to prove you wrong, to show that I'm better, I'm more equipped, and that is the polarizing point, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. Michael, let me turn to you, and I'm wondering, do you think that I think that both Carolyn and George said there are some deep divisions. Are they deeper than they were in the past? Were they always there? Is it just the expression or how people are dealing with the cultural, political, other divisions and conflicts that have been there all along?
Yeah, thank you. First, let me just say thanks for the chance to be here and part of this gathering, which is so heartening, and to be on this panel, including George. George, with you, I'm sure you have no recollection of this, but 20 years ago, as a college student, I was writing to share differences of perspective in relationship to the Iraq War, and with some of the cases that you were advancing at that time. And so somehow it feels perfectly appropriate to now be on this panel discussing polarization and constructive engagement across difference. So that just felt like a funny life synchronicity when that opportunity arose. So just a couple things on this question. So in total agreement with I think what both my colleagues have shared, and Carolyn, what you were saying specifically about conflict and difference being the heart of human diversity and capacity for flourishing. And really, I might even take that a step further and just say that all social progress comes through a deepening capacity for constructive engagement across difference. Any issue that you look at, our ability to move forward on that issue in a way that serves the interests of justice and healing and positive transformation is really about how do we work together across various forms of difference, both strategically, but also just philosophically, to understand our alignments go much deeper. But what's unique in this time, and social science in many respects has documented this, is that the degree of contempt for people who see things differently than we do, particularly in politics, is really growing and reaching a state that is somewhat unprecedented, at least in the degree to which we've been studying these questions. So I do think by this measure we're in trouble. I mean, just the indicators of political violence, threats of violence, active violence, and so forth are much higher than they have been at any other time in modern history. And I think so polarization or conflict is not the issue. It's the dehumanization of the other that arises out of that polarization when we're engaging in ways that aren't grounded and mature or respectful of those with whom we have differences. And, you know, just one thing to highlight on this, the research also shows that actually people on the political left who often espouse the greatest values around equality or tolerance of difference and so forth, actually across political divisions tend to have less respect for people who think differently than they do than in the inverse. So I'll let you sit with that one while we continue on this conversation.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, I'm seeing a lot of commonality here about, yeah, there are deep differences. Maybe, George, maybe you said a little bit more that these cultural divisions are even deeper than they were in the past. Now, so, and Carolyn and Michael, you were talking more about the contempt and need to prove others wrong and so forth. So one question is, we're all saying that there's something kind of going wrong here culturally. So one question is, well, why? There have been lots of things have been discussed. The fact that people have so many diverse sources of information and that people get siloed into different sources of information, and there are other things as well. But I also would like to get to what are the implications of this? I mean, I think Franciscan Action Network as an organization that does, policy advocacy, we come up against this all the time, against, this bill or that bill that actually it's pretty widely supported, but it'll never pass because of polarization or political tribalism, right? Because it has all these sponsors from one party, forget it. No, the other party will not sign on, even if many of them agree with it. To find, I mean, it happens sometimes still that there's legislation that has bipartisan support, but it's pretty rare, and I think rarer than it used to be. So let me come back to you, George, and ask you, first of all, I mean, do you have any thoughts on why there are these particularly deep cultural divisions as you describe them now? And do you think that there are public policy issues on which Americans could reach consensus solutions, except that they're so, one side cannot support whatever it is the other side proposes? Or do you think that we're having a very hard time passing legislation and so forth just because the divisions are that deep?
Michelle, I think the increasing secularization of our society and culture must have something to do with this. The fact that Americans are looking, it seems, according to all the survey data I see, far less frequently to what we might call biblical models of good behavior. than was the case in what was even 30 or 40 years ago, still manifestly a Christian or Judeo-Christian country. That has to have something to do with this. Secondly, I think a lot of people feel scared today. I think some people are deeply frightened by what they think is a threat to what they understand to be rights. Other people are deeply scared, frightened by what they perceive as a tidal wave of cultural sludge that has become ubiquitous by reason of social media and other technologies. They see what this is doing to children. They see what it's doing to young adults. They look at the mental health statistics among young people, and they're really frightened. Where might we find some common cause? One of the things that I find most disturbing about recent Washington politics is that there was agreement fairly recently on a beginning of immigration reform, which everyone agrees has to be addressed. It was not a perfect bill, but it was a bipartisan bill. And it was essentially killed by Donald Trump because he wanted a campaign issue. The failure of other Republicans to get up and say, look, we are tired of this. We would like to get something done here is very, very disturbing. On the other hand, I live in the state of Maryland. I haven't been home for 2 weeks. I've been in Rome since the end of September. But our TV was awash with ads in favor and promoting the candidacy of the Democratic senatorial candidate. And these ads were promoting abortion on demand almost as a kind of civic sacrament. That if you did not believe in this, if you did not believe in absolutely unfettered access to abortion at all stages of a pregnancy, you were somehow not a real American. So this kind of overheated rhetoric in the service of what are really bad ends is something that I think people of goodwill have got to get much more vocal in challenging, because this stuff goes on because we allow it to go.
Thanks, George. Michael, I'd like to go to you with this same question. Any comment you have on why, you use the words contempt, dehumanization to characterize political communication these days? Why do you think that's the case? And then also on the same issue that George commented on public policy issues, do you think there actually is, or is there not more common ground in the public than there is in the political space where the decisions are made?
Okay, where to start on this one? Why is this happening? I mean, you can ask that question at so many different it's a complex system that is interacting in a way that produces these outcomes. It's no one driver. Our organization teaches about, to start with, the very dualistic nature of the brain. The way that we are taught, or not taught, our biology is conditioned to see distinction between self, other, left, right, up, down, so on and so forth, in ways that play out in group formation, belonging, and identity development that play out at the corporate scale, right? And creating these categories of otherness that are very socially constructed. So let's start there. And in the last, 20, 30 years, demographers refer to it as this phenomenon of sorting, where there used to be difference, including even within parties. You had conservative Southern Democrats, you had liberal Northeastern conservative Republicans, liberal Republicans Northeastern. For a variety of reasons, and especially because various interests have used kind of wedge issues to polarize the electorate based on defined identity structures. that is no longer the case, right? The parties have essentially purified themselves of difference and become not places where ideological diversity is really tolerated, but it's really quelled. And so, and you combine that then with, of course, the modern media ecosystem where people don't have to engage across difference. You can exist in a bubble in which only your own views are being reinforced. And because of this phenomenon more broadly of sorting, it's highly predictive. Now, if you know your race, class, income, and zip code, within the 90s percentile that somebody can tell you what your partisan orientations are. And that sorting creates this dynamic where people aren't engaging across difference. The skill of dealing with difference is atrophying in our society, is my perspective on that. In the core of it is, of course, there is so much more that we have in common than what may be visible in our national political discourse. Issues that are polarized at a political level, when you really drill into the data. I was listening to something recently on immigration. George brought up immigration. And, immigrant sentiments have swung dramatically in the last few years for a number of reasons, including, the national political conversation, what's actually happening at the border, other things. But if you actually get into the data, it's so interesting. People actually really do believe in the value of immigration in our society, the need to support immigrants, to have a positive experience, to have their needs met, to get supported economically to stand up their families and communities. Those numbers are actually holding relatively stable. And it's only when you touch on the litmus kind of political issues then that level of polarization increases. And you can say in my experience, that's true across issues. Gun safety, gun control is another one where there's huge blocks of people who support things. But then at the political level, it gets sorted based on identity. You get special interests who are polarizing the electorate, who are invested in creating a logjam, just like George was talking about. And so progress isn't possible. And we're led to believe that we're so polarized in ways that actually aren't necessarily the reality underneath the surface.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. So I'm going to turn to you with the "What's a Franciscan to do" question. I also, if you want to comment on any of the other questions, Carolyn, you're very welcome. But you are a Franciscan. I want to ask you, Franciscans, see themselves as following Jesus in the footsteps of Saint Francis, one of the most famous peacemakers in history. So, what's the role of Franciscans at a time of deep divisions? I know this is something you've thought about and worked on quite a bit.
Yes. For me, the basis of a lot of this is fear. We're afraid of losing what is owed me, is due to me, I'm entitled to. And that fear then branches out to greed and violence. For Franciscans and for any person of goodwill, we are called to be peacemakers. If we follow a man called Jesus, we are called to be peacemakers. What does that look like? It's sitting with your brother or sister in the mud when they are at their lowest and listening to their stories, listening to them tell you, I don't have money to buy food for my children, or I have to decide between money to pay rent and money for food. And you're not fixing them, you're listening. You're listening with a heart of the gospel, a nonviolent heart. That's what a Franciscan does. That's what a follower of Francis and a follower of Jesus, that's their stance. It's not to demonize, victimize, polarize, because they're already there, right? It's our job to bring them to a level where they can stand eye to eye, shoulder to shoulder, and feel held, feel loved, and feel heard. And that takes a lot of doing, but it's not done enough. And when we can stand up and do that, miracles can happen. You don't have to do the fixing. The work will happen when you can stand with your brother or sister in the mud. And that's what we're called as followers of Francis and Jesus to do. People of goodwill, people who say, I want the same things. I want to feed families. I want to see the poor taken care of. I don't want migrants or refugees mistreated. I don't think any of us want that. And yet, we continue to buy into situations, civilizations that continue to do that. And similar to racism, racism continues because someone benefits from it. And if you took away the benefit, racism would disappear. So think about, what am I benefiting from this? And my brother or sister in the mud, are they benefiting too? And sit with that question.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm going to do sort of a lightning round. I want to ask you to each to give just a short answer to a question, because I do want to give our participants here and online a chance to ask you their questions. But look, I can't leave this panel without asking you, what's your best piece of advice? What's your best piece of advice to a Franciscan-hearted person who wants to be true to their convictions, but also be a peace builder? And especially, we're in a very contentious political season, and I suspect it's going to go on for months. I suspect it won't be quite over the first week of November. So George, let me go to you first. What's your piece of advice for us?
Model Christian behavior with everyone, particularly in your civic life. And that means living according to the understanding that tolerance does not mean ignoring differences as if differences made no difference, or exacerbating differences for political gain. Tolerance comes from the Latin verb tolerare, which means to bear with or to suffer with. So real tolerance is engaging differences within a bond of civility and respect, in which we understand that we are all seeking the truth, and those of us who have found the truth in the Lord Jesus wish to share that truth with others, and we're only going to do that by treating them with the dignity, treating them with respect for the human dignity that is theirs. Model that, and the world will change.
Thank you, George. Michael?
Yeah. I think in the spirit of Jesus and Francis, having the courage to be willing to challenge the group consensus is one thing that, in Francis's time, Sister Julia was talking about feudalism was the dominant system, and it was considered ordained by God for there to be a class of people who ruled over most people. And Francis's response to that was to just exit and to then hold up a loving mirror rooted in solidarity with everyone. So being willing to challenge the group consensus and then to go super practical. I've been so inspired by this methodology that's being developed called deep canvassing. And, you know, in political times, rather than just trying to call people and harangue them to convince them of your side, it's all about listening. And it's using deep conversations for an extended period of time. These are door knockers who will talk for an hour with somebody to hear their story, identify points of shared values, and then work from there based on connection, true connection and respect. And it's been shown to be an extremely effective also tool for political education, political formation, and political engagement, but in a completely different paradigm that doesn't start with the assumption that I know better than you what's best for you. So I think that's Deep Canvassing, New Conversations Initiative, I believe is the organization.
All right. All right. Carolyn, your piece of advice.
Yeah, telling and listening to the stories, but listen without judgment. And be curious. Ask better and bigger questions. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm sure hearing a lot from all of you. I think about relationship building. Because in my own experience, this is true that once you've had deep conversations, you've listened to somebody else's stories and what has led them to that place. You've had a conversation that's not about convincing, that's really about just understanding each other, learning about each other better. Once you're at that place, the thought of dehumanizing that person with your speech or using violence against them, it's unthinkable at that point, right? But so the question is how to get there with more and more people. All right, we have time for a few questions from the audience, so please raise your hand. We're just going to share one.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for speaking. My name is Emilio Alvarez, Director of Campus Ministry from Viterbo University in La Crosse, Wisconsin.
Yeah. Woo.
I have two questions. One question, I'm also a secular Franciscan, so I really appreciate this this topic. One question I have is that what is the risk if the individual who is sitting in the muck with other individuals in the muck of their lives, what's the risk if they don't conform themselves to the gospel before they do that work? Because one of the questions is that in my own personal formation, I found that maybe I was going to those places and I wasn't being properly conformed to the gospel. And so then I feel like other things were kind of, other things were kind of coming to the forefront. And then the other one was tolerance. Have you ever seen tolerance been used for a gain of power? It's good to be tolerant until someone then gains power over someone else.
Okay, I'm going to ask the panelists to bear these questions in mind. We're going to take a couple more, and then I'm just going to give each of the three of you a chance to respond, okay? Because we're short on time.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Hi, it's me, Sister Julia. I'd love to hear some comments on collective transformation and what it takes from us as individuals and as groups as we allow Christ to make the world anew every day. Yeah, thanks.
Is there one more?
Davey Key, University of Georgia. I want to theologize the political process at the moment. How is God using Donald Trump and how is God using Kamala Harris?
Interesting. Do we have any questions online? Not at this point. Okay, so we have some really interesting questions here. And so which of the panelists feels motivated, ready to jump in? Sorry, is there one question online? Okay, let's hear it.
This is for George. I wonder about your assumption that everyone is seeking the truth. There is much discussion about our living in a post-truth society.
Okay, well, let me start, if I may, Michelle, in response.
Okay, go ahead.
I hope this doesn't insult Franciscans. I'm an old school Thomist, and I believe that there is an innate desire for truth and good built into everyone that was not extinguished by original sin, that's still there. And the postmodern epistemologists can argue till the cows come home about there's your truth and my truth, but nothing called the truth, and they're just wrong. But there is this desire for the good and the true and the beautiful built into us. I have no idea what God has in mind for Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. I'm still trying to figure out what God has in mind for the Synod here in Rome. That's tough enough to figure out. What I do know is that Americans are capable of transformative change when their consciences are aroused. I grew up in a totally segregated city, both legally and psychologically. And I watched that change through the power of aroused consciences in the classic civil rights movement between the mid-1950s and 1960s. I have chronicled the dramatic changes that came over Central and Eastern Europe through the revolution of conscience that John Paul II ignited in Poland in June 1979. Solidarity was once brilliantly described by Father Joseph Tishner as a great forest planted by aroused consciences. So if you want a Franciscan / Johnny Appleseed prescription for the American future, let's plant a forest of aroused consciences.
Okay. Carolyn, Michael, which one of you would like to? Carolyn, are you ready to go?
This work of being a disciple is not a one-off. You do this work day in and day out. You sit in the mud day in and day out as long as it takes. We have the power. We do. I've said this to my table. I've said this to my group. I'm the daughter of 2 Baptist preachers, so I'm going to preach a little bit here. Okay? One of my favorite scriptures is Romans, and it says, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is that power that lives in you. How are you using that power? And if you really believe that, imagine what change we could make. The change can start in this room. We have that power. That is within us. And that's not pie in the sky. That is scriptural. That is who we are. That is our foundation. But we need to believe it because someone previous to this generation had that power that got us in the mess we're in today. Right? Yes. So how are you going to live into that power? Just think about that.
Thanks, Carolyn. Michael. How are you going to follow that, Michael?
Yeah.
You get the last word.
Well, this is gonna not do justice to that. Let me not try. The question on can tolerance be used to gain power over another? I think as human beings, we can use anything that we think of, and especially even things that we think of as good or ideals, as subtle ways to gain power over others. And I think that's the spiritual life, is learning the discernment between those things. You know, when is it truly about respect for another, and when is it about proving my superiority to somebody else? And then on the collective transformation, a little bit, just our organization teaches the practice of contemplation, among other things. And the idea is that every human being, our fundamental addiction is to our own way of thinking. We're all addicts. You know, we all look at the world through our own view and think my way of looking at the world is righter than everybody else's way of looking at the world. And we happen to follow in the footsteps of this founder figure of Christianity named Jesus, who rather than trying to exercise a domination form of power to say this is the political order that we need to gain, role modeled a power of the spirit through the surrender of his own physical power, to the point of accepting, execution by the state to reveal the depth of what love looks like in the world. And so what does it take to gain collective transformation? It gains a willingness to say that I am not sure about my ideas about what's better and what's worse. And I have strong courage and submission in service to things that are bigger than me, that are mystery at the end of the day. And if we can't learn how to do that collectively, then we're never going to escape a constant competition for power that is always going to be a zero-sum game.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists, George Weigel, Michael Poffenberger, Carolyn Towns, for a lot to think about, I think, a lot to carry us through the coming weeks.